So perhaps in the interest of time, we'll get our session started. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to LSO's first virtual webinar of 2022. My name is Chris Delvecchio. I'm a principal at Shift Health and volunteer with LSO's Breakfast Meeting Committee. It's my pleasure this morning to facilitate an exciting discussion focused on the topic of psychedelics for medical use. But before we begin, and recognizing that we're meeting today on a virtual platform, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home in order to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and our responsibility in improving our understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures. So I recognize the land which I'm standing on today in Sarnia, Ontario, and where I'm fortunate enough to raise my family, is covered by Treaty 29, established in 1827, and it's the traditional territory of many nations, including Anishinaabe, Attawandarunk, and Mississauga peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So I would just encourage everyone to reflect on the importance and tradition of the lands that you find yourselves on today as well. So I secondly want to thank our event sponsor, Fsd Pharma. Fsd is a biotech company focused on developing novel solutions for brain and inflammatory disorders with 3 drug candidates in different stages of development. Lucid Psychoceuticals is a wholly owned subsidiary of FSD, and it's focused on its lead compounds, Lucid Psych and Lucid MS, for the potential treatment of mental health disorders and neurodegenerative disorders, respectively. So we really appreciate and thank you for your sponsorship of this event. So it's my pleasure now to introduce you to our panel, who are really bringing some diverse perspectives to today's discussion. First, Deborah Russell O'Neill, who's a patient advocate for the use of psychedelics. Lakshmi Kotra, professor within the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto and senior scientist at UHN and CEO of Lucid Psychoceuticals. David Clements, executive director of psychedelics research and senior advisor for innovation strategy and policy at Queen's University. And finally, David Wood, chief legal officer and general counsel at Psygen Industries. So welcome, panel. Thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to share your thoughts. So we'll begin with some introductions and your experience in psychedelics for medical use to just ground the conversation before we delve into some specific topics. And I'll just remind the audience to please include questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom platform, and we'll identify some popular topics so that we can pose those questions to the panelists at the end, closer to the end of the session. So let's begin, panelists, please. I'll start with Deb Russell. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing your introduction and background. Thanks, Deb.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Debbie Russell. I was a firefighter with the City of Toronto for the past 15 years. Much like a vast number of those on the front lines, my career was sidelined in 2015 due to concurrent autoimmune disease and PTSD. I was fortunate enough to connect with Dr. Gabor Mate, who introduced me to the healing potential of psychedelics. So for the past several years, he sent me across Canada to work with various facilitators and medicines. So I've worked with the common pathogens such as MDMA and 3-MMC, and I've also worked extensively with the classic psychedelics of ayahuasca, LSD, DMT, and ketamine. I went on to study psychedelic psychotherapy, and I currently practice in the underground community, mostly serving first responders. And I work primarily with MDMA, 3-MMC, and ketamine. So when talking about the benefits of psychedelics, I find it to be a really difficult thing to quantify because the experience is largely an ineffable one. So it's much like trying to describe the color 9. But I would say with the utmost certainty that, you know, without the intervention of Gabor and the use of psychedelics, I really wouldn't be here today. So I can give you kind of one small example from one of my experiences on the effects that it's had in my life. So I have a history of childhood sexual abuse from the age of 7. So when someone has an experience like that, it sets up the brain in like dysfunctional neural patterns. So whatever wires together or whatever fires together, wires together. So I did experience classic PTSD symptoms such as depression, addictions, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, suicidal ideation. But what I find really interesting about the psychedelic experience is that what's common with people with sexual abuse is that I had a coupling of this shame with disgust and love. So it was essentially, I couldn't experience love without having this overshadowing of shame and disgust with it. So when that occurs, it can kind of manifest in your life in a few dysfunctional ways. So I would be getting into abusive and toxic relationships. I had this also this black and white thinking, things were either good or bad. And then what I found paradoxical to this coupling of emotions, so this big ball of emotions, was that even though I had all these emotions tied up in a big ball, I could only experience one at a time. And I was completely unaware of any other emotion that was there. So it's essentially like I either loved you or hated you. There was no, being mad at you, but also understanding that I loved you. I just didn't have that capability. And I was completely unconscious to it. And as you can imagine, it wreaked some havoc on my interpersonal relationships. So on MDMA, I had the experience of separation of these three things, the shame, the disgust, as well as the love. And I had the opportunity to have the real felt sense, like the visceral embodiment in my cells of what each one felt like individually. So I felt what shame felt like for the first time. I felt what disgust felt like for the first time. And what that allowed me to do was look at these feelings and experience them in a way that wasn't overwhelming to me, or send me into this dark vortex of hell. And it also gave me an idea of what those individual feelings were so that I could more identify them when they came up in my everyday life. But what I found really beneficial and what blows my mind is the fact that I had no idea what unencumbered love felt like. So I was completely oblivious to what love was. I mean, I thought I knew what it was, but I obviously didn't. I always had this overshadowing of the shame and the disgust. So to have that experience of what unencumbered actual love felt like was completely transformative for me. It just gave me a complete imprint on my body. It changed the whole blueprint of who I am. And of course, it transformed my relationships with my husband, my kids, and most importantly, it transformed the relationship to myself. So that's just kind of one small example. And so now I kind of endeavor to assist others in the same way, in the best way I can.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that lived experience, Deb. We appreciate that. I'd like to turn next to Lashmi to provide some clinical and therapeutic development perspective in this field, please.
Thank you, Chris. And Deb, thank you very much for sharing your experience. And the outset, in my professional life, whatever you're going to see, affiliations, whatnot, all of that, but at the core of it as a person, my goal is to bring therapeutic solutions or drugs or medicines to make patients' lives better. If we can cure, potentially cures. So with that, my affiliations, as you see, I'm at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Pharmacy, and I'm also a researcher at the University Health Network. Next slide, please. And I do have to disclose, I have several affiliations to companies that either I was part of company formation or otherwise advised a company. And with Fsd Pharma, I pretty much help them with biotech drug development concepts. Can you, next slide, please? I just want to give a very short introduction to Fsd Pharma. And one of the goals at Fsd is total brain health, or in pursuit of total brain health. And I'm going to clarify that as we go through this particular session through my comments on what that means. Next slide, please. So as a public company, certainly anything that is coming out of Fsd slides in my presentation here need to be carefully viewed, especially on the forward statements. Next slide. You can pass this, Brian. Yeah, forward-looking statements in the next slide, please. So there are three pipeline molecules right now in three different areas. One is in mental health, which is lucid psych. And I'm using the word here, mental health, for a particular reason, and I will try to clarify as we go along. And the next one is in neurodegenerative disorders, and multiple sclerosis is the primary indication that we're going after. In these two, the molecules are in the enabling studies, and the lucid psych is the molecule that's inspired by psychedelics. And the third one is an anti-inflammatory area, Fsd PEA. Next slide, please. And I'm going to skip some of this marketing. It's probably not relevant for the panel discussion, but the bottom line out of this is that there is a huge need across the globe in the context of mental health, and COVID certainly accelerated or made this a primary, one of the major pandemics, if you will, in a way. The mental health is showing up. Next slide, please. And what I want to do through this slide is, you see here a schematic of a human being and neurons on either side. But I want to draw our attention to the idea that brain and spinal cord in our bodies, they pretty much control every activity that happens in our body. That includes our thoughts, feelings, whatnot, things like that. And psychedelics essentially fall into the category of, as you saw, mental health related. And there is neurodegeneration or conditions like Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis that fall under a different category where something goes wrong with the neurons of the brain or the spinal cord. So at least that's the science that we have been thinking about, learning about in medicine for a very long time. And so at Fsd, these two are being pursued in the context of total brain health. Next slide, please. We can probably go to the next one. So this is a slide that I'm going to probably spend a little bit of time. This is a 2021 article. I thought this is a very nicely conceptualized one. There are about 4 boxes here. And the topmost box, you see therapeutic mechanisms of psychedelics and maximizing both efficacy and safety. What I want to put that in the context is that when we go to a hospital in the medical system, let's put it that way, pharmacists, nurses, doctors who see the patients many times for the first time, how can they relate the patient's condition to a particular drug, right? So that's where the therapeutic mechanisms, or what are these molecules when we take them, are doing in our body, and how are they going to make the body react to them, is the idea. And as the bigger box that is bottom right side shows there is a need to embrace multiple perspectives. And I totally agree with that in terms of where psychedelics stand right now in the society today, from every perspective, and work across length scales and take advantage of latest scientific tools. And so that basically what that means is there is more to be learned about them before these molecules, where they stand from the regulatory point of view and medical standpoint of view, to become like mainstream drugs. So this is a slide that I want to highlight in that. Next slide, please. And these are my personal thoughts. I've been involved in drug discovery development for almost 30 years now, and have been associated with multiple types of drugs. And at the outset, psychedelics are what we call in the drug world as CNS acting agents. That is, these are drugs that act on the brain or spinal cord in that area, central nervous system. And we try to be extremely careful from the pharmaceutical industry standpoint of view when we deal with molecules or drugs that act on the brain or spinal cord, because brain and spinal cord basically control our body. If the drugs do anything that is unintended to that body in the brain or spinal cord, it's a very difficult thing to bring that back, right? So that's the idea of the I can replace a heart, I can replace a kidney, I can't replace a brain, right? So that's the premise in that area, psychedelics and CNS acting agents, and how in medical community or pharmaceutical community we look at that. So the bottom bullet point there, development through clinical trials, meaning that studying all types of effects all around. I know it's probably sometimes not a popular area, but is something that for wider acceptance or wider adoption, if you will, is something that I think it will be happening in due time. I think that's my last slide, and I'm going to leave the rest of them for the next session. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Leslie, providing that clinical development perspective. I'll turn next to David Clements. David, you're on mute.
Thanks very much, and thanks everybody for joining today. I did want to acknowledge before I began the support for our research collaborative at Queen's coming from Dimensions Health Centers. Dimensions has been a tremendous foresight, I think, in establishing the Dimensions Fund and the support of the study of psychedelics, which has led to the formation of the Dimensions Health Research Collaborative last summer, which I joined in June as the executive director. I guess by way of an intro, and we'll have a lot of time in the discussion, I hope, to get into some of these questions, is really what do we think our contribution is and can be in a university like Queen's to this rapidly developing space. And I think one of the things I would note is just the importance of a very broad-based approach here. I mean, we most certainly will need more preclinical research. We will need clinical research supporting the use of a whole range of psychedelics, from very old ones to very new ones. And we definitely anticipate, like other universities, that we will have a footprint in that area. And I'm very encouraged to see that there's growing interest from a whole range of scientists in the country in this so-called period of renaissance as it pertains to psychedelics. But I think we see a very urgent need right now simply around translating and synthesizing the knowledge that does exist, and to do that with very specific knowledge users in mind. And I would say, you know, shadowing to Deb, patients first and foremost, clinicians and policymakers. We're going to face some very tough decisions in this area, and we really do need, wherever possible, the policy to follow the evidence here, rather than the evidence following the policy or decisions. My background really is in strategic policy, knowledge translation, research administration, and those sorts of areas. So that really influences, I think, my introductory comments. I would say, as we think about what some of the needs are here, you know, it's important to reflect, as Deb noted, we're not talking about drugs that we are waiting for at the end of a pipeline. We are talking about substances that are very easily accessed on a legal market or a gray market in Canada and other countries. You can very easily find psilocybin mushrooms, well, probably in the wild if you have a basic, book to help you identify those drugs. I'm not advising you do that, but it can be done. And certainly you can find companies that will send those things via Canada Post to you to arrive on your doorstep tomorrow. So yes, we certainly need trials in this area. We need strong evidence to support not only the use of psychedelics, but also the context in which those psychedelics are used. How important is place and setting in those areas? We have patients that have very significant needs, and in many cases, patients that have been very poorly served or even harmed by current options in the system. We need to be thinking very much about how do we generate the evidence that helps patients, but also understanding that these are, as I say, very easily accessible substances, how we pursue a harm reduction approach to advise patients that are able to access these things, and certainly through what they're seeing in popular culture or in The Guardian or the Globe and Mail that seems to run a piece on psychedelics just about every week about what they should know to make decisions. Similarly, clinicians that are doing their best to care for patients right now. If we look at cannabis as an example, there will be some clinicians who have experience in this area, either personal or professional, or have been doing this kind of work on an underground basis. We have others who, as they did in the case of cannabis, will simply shut down any inquiries or requests from patients. We desperately need to think about independent, unbiased, continuing education for healthcare professionals in this area about where this field is and where this field is heading. And certainly that's an area at Queen's that we see that we can have a very significant contribution. Down the road, looking at perhaps more formalized education, but I think there's a need to produce that urgent support and to do it very soon. And finally, as we think about policymakers, I mean, it's very easy for a lot of us to beat up on the policymakers. And maybe it's because I spent a lot of time in those environments, either federally or provincially, that I'm a bit more empathetic than others might be. But I think we do have to reflect that policymakers are trying to make decisions about substances that are currently classified in Canada alongside cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl. And so certainly they will be, looking at treaties that Canada has signed internationally and asking themselves within what framework are they working as they make decisions about the setting and context of psychedelics in the country. They will be looking at safety evidence that is being generated from a range of sources and asking themselves, what do we do about this? And finally, they will be working within a context in which they expect high quality evidence produced by accepted methodologies to help to guide them in their decision making. And we use terms in policy settings like policy authority and financial authority. They will very much be asking themselves, what is the policy? What has my deputy head, my deputy minister, in the case of Health Canada or otherwise, what have they been asked to do? And what is the context in which I'm working? What are the directives that I've received? And we need to think about as evidence generators and evidence synthesizers in this country about how we can assist those folks and to do so quite rapidly in what I think is a very rapidly changing context.
Thank you so much, David. And we'll take some time in our next part to dive into the types of evidence that policymakers and clinicians are going to need to move this forward, as well as the public. I'll turn next to David Wood, provide your perspective from a legal and regulatory perspective.
Thank you. Yes, and I think it's very interesting how we heard from Deb on a more of a direct patient experience and saw the reason why this is important, and as was recognized by the host, I believe, the importance of mental health management now more than ever. I mean, it was a problem prior to the pandemic, and what everyone's gone through during the pandemic for a variety of reasons have exacerbated that. And then we saw from FSD, we heard about a business plan in the space, which also demonstrated how the psychedelics can help with mental health conditions, but there's also a lot of research on neurodegenerative conditions and some of the other work that was discussed in FSD's presentation. And that I think it's important to recognize that people reflexively compare this to cannabis, and the comparison does not make sense in a lot of ways. And part of that is because psychedelics are a lot of different drugs. And I think if you reflect on what David said about policy, how psychedelics are put side by side with opiates and cocaine, that's a good indicator of some of the damage to our understanding of the topic that the drug war has done. I mean, cannabis is certainly quite different than psychedelics, which are certainly quite different from opiates and cocaine, and psychedelics are different from each other. I mean, you can't really compare LSD and DMT in other than a couple basic and obvious common points between them. They're pretty different, and the way they're going to be used clinically is going to be pretty different. So I'm very, very happy that this entire group of drugs is being studied more. It's not just one drug like with cannabis, or one bouquet of drugs that comes from the same plant and the same kind of input material. And that's why I'm just absolutely thrilled to be working at Psygen, a manufacturer of psychedelic drugs here in Calgary. We're a licensed dealer as of Monday. We're now licensed to synthesize and deal with LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, DMT, mescaline, 2CB, and psilocin. And we have methods being validated for GMP synthesis of ibogaine and 5-methoxy-DMT as well. We work with psychedelics that are not controlled in Canada. And I came into this from a really great law firm from BLG, and I see Beverly Moore, a real expert in her areas, one of the people in the audience, one of my former colleagues, and someone I have a ton of respect for. So it's, for me personally, I'm very happy to have taken over a decade of experience at a large national law firm and apply it in-house at a manufacturer who isn't trying to develop a drug product. We just want to manufacture the substances so that people like Deb can hopefully get the access to and benefit of these medicines on simpler terms than what Deb had to do, and what many Canadians are doing every day right now, which is accessing them through illicit channels. And even the people who are given permission to possess psychedelics through the efforts of groups like LSO, a nonprofit that I do a lot of pro bono work for outside of Psygen. Even those Canadians, while they're permitted to possess and they're permitted to use psilocybin in consistently with the terms of the exemptions they've received, they still have to source it illicitly. And that's where it's getting very interesting to me, is whether psychedelics, and I'd say particularly psilocybin, are going to stay where they are right now, which is pharmaceuticals only, get a DIN, and then it's prescribable. Until then, no, maybe these exemptions, maybe special access, or whether, and again, with psilocybin specifically, whether we'll see a regulated system, much like we do with cannabis products, but still under the CDSA, not with any big change in status, no effect on how we interact with the UN, but maybe regulations under the CDSA, very similar to the ACMPR, which we saw before the Cannabis Act. That's possible. And if our regulator and the legislator want to, and Canadians want to, that might be a way to get psilocybin, which has a pretty strong safety record, into a regulated market that's more accessible and less costly in dollar terms for Canadians. Again, when we have a bigger than ever mental health challenge and an economy that has taken as much a beating as mental health has in the last 2 years. So I'm really enthusiastic and hopeful that we might see some sort of liberalizing of laws around psilocybin, because Canada has the regulatory infrastructure, we have the administrative expertise, we have people that are used to tracking cannabis. A lot of that could be applied in a very straightforward fashion to products that just have a different active. Still selling a product that has active ingredients listed, no health claim, a warning, and accessed only through a special system. And unlike cannabis, the way people tend to use psilocybin is less frequently and in much closer contact with their physician, with the mental health, with psychology and psychotherapy services. So I think we can also do a much better job of having a medical system outside of pharmaceuticals, but where data is obtained and gathered and tracked better than it was with the medical cannabis system. And if the law stays exactly the way it is, we're still going to see a lot of Canadians get help. So I'm just very encouraged by all the research and the work to basically pick up where we left off in the early 1970s when policies and laws changed.
Thank you so much, David. And we'll dive a little bit more into different regulatory structures that sort of balance the safeguards and pros and cons of each in a minute. But you just touched on a point that where these therapies may be used in close contact with clinicians in certain settings, there's this notion of set and setting that's somewhat unique to psychedelics. And I just want to turn to Deb to maybe describe that to the audience today and how you'd like to see that evolve over time and how it may contrast to traditional pharmaceuticals.
So I feel like traditional pharmaceuticals tend to have a focus on treating the symptomology, whereas I find psychedelics tend to address the underlying issues that cause the symptoms. And I mean, I'm not talking microdoses, I'm talking like heavier, larger therapeutic doses. I would say that the medicine itself probably accounts for about 20% of the experience or the process. And beyond that, what you referred to as a set and setting. So for me, that includes basically three phases. You have the preparation phase, you have the experience. So you need to have good facilitation with the experience. And then integration makes up pretty much those three things makes up the remaining 80%. So if you don't attend to that 80% well and effectively, then the experience could just turn out to be another trip or another high, and you're not going to get the benefits from it that you're looking for. Plus, it's also going to perpetuate that problem, that resistance that we've been fighting against, that there's no therapeutic value to these drugs, right? So anyways, more specifically, preparation for me includes building a base set of skills in the patient. So you need to increase things like their somatic awareness, their mindfulness, their perceptive awareness. So things like their ability to resource themselves towards safety, their capacity to be in their body. So that can be with people with trauma, particularly sexual trauma, that can be a really difficult thing. They probably haven't been in their body since the event occurred. It's a very uncomfortable place to be. So, and I mean, there's your breeding ground for things like addiction and self-harm and reckless behavior and so on. So if you are introducing psychedelics to someone who is resistant to being in their body, then you can actually, or when they're completely disembodied, then you can actually do more harm than good. So the second part of that is good facilitation. So part of being having good facilitation for the experience is creating an environment of safety. If that's the only thing that happens, then that's quite valuable to the patient during the experience, because that's what you're trying to internally build with people essentially too, is that sense of internal safety. So you need facilitation with someone who has skills to be able to assist someone when times get hard in the experience, because it will get hard. That's kind of the nature of psychedelics. It's not a passive experience, it's more of an active experience, so it will get hard. And I find, like, I've heard a lot of stories, and I've had the experience myself of you're going through a hard time, and if your facilitator doesn't have the skills or the ability to assist you in that, or they assist you in the wrong way, it can actually be re-traumatizing. So good facilitation for sure. Then on the other side of that is the integration. And I say that integration is usually where the rubber hits the road, essentially, right? So you're trying to make sense of the experience, you're trying to learning to apply the experience to your own life, you're building personal skills that support the ongoing integration. So that we're talking about things like meditation, yoga, connecting with nature, that type of thing. And you can look at integration as a lifelong process too. I'm still working on integrating things from my first ayahuasca experience 5 years ago. It'll come in at the oddest of times. And so I like to say that it's kind of like putting a giant puzzle together after this experience. All these supportive kind of modalities and measures are adding a piece here and there. And so it's not really so much about the medicine itself, but it's, you know, what are you going to do with it afterwards, right? Mm-hmm. And so I know organizations in places like Field Trip and Numinous have adopted more of a holistic approach. And so I guess the question remains, like, how do you offer these psychedelic services on more of like a larger scale and also ensure this all-encompassing approach, right?
Thank you, Deb. And I see Lakshmi wants to quickly add something to that, and I'll turn to David Wood after.
Yes, I'm very, very inspired by the comments both from David and Deb. Just wanted to delineate here a couple of things. One is what we call as a drug or a medicine, which I'm purely talking about the psilocybin or the mushrooms or whatever the LSDs are. That's a component that is given to the patient. And then comes the clinical use, which is the setting or how the patient takes whatnot. I'm trying to separate those two simply because there could be a lot of confusion when we try to bring these two together. The drug standpoint of view, that is where the manufacturers or growers or whoever is coming into the picture, right? If we take, for example, cannabis as an example, we're talking about cannabis, not THC, right? THC is a substance, pure substance. Cannabis is plant product. Versus if we talk about mushrooms versus psilocybin. Psilocybin is pure substance versus mushrooms are natural product. They're quite different. And coming to the clinical use, same thing. A doctor prescribing, and I go buy in a shop or wherever else and take it versus the other things that are associated with it, especially in psychedelics, the psychotherapy, things of that nature. So when we talk about policy, regulation, all of these sorts of things, these have to be very clearly be mentioned. What government is controlling right now is cannabis. If I want to buy pure THC, Nabilon or something similar to that, it's my doctor has to prescribe highly controlled. I don't go and buy it out there. So I want to clarify these things for the everyone who are listening here. When I talk about psilocybin, I'm talking about pure compound. Control on that is going to be much higher simply because Deb highlighted it here. If it is not administered properly, not used properly by the patient, it could go worse. And that's pure compound, it's much easier to happen. Hence, we need all the evidence that we need. So all the companies or whoever is developing and that. So when we discuss any of this, it's very important to be precise, accurate, and position that in the whole treatment protocols. Let's stop there.
Thank you, Lakshmi. And that's a good transition to David Wood, I think, who wanted to respond to some points that Deb made, but also David Wood to elaborate maybe on some different access structures and systems and some of the pros and cons in terms of allowing access in the right way that balances sort of the safeguards for populations at the same time. David, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'd love to. And so with respect to Deb's comments, just wanted to make two observations to kind of help the audience see this in a practical way. First, I'd say almost all of the psychotherapeutic applications of psychedelics that I'm aware of relate to trauma. They relate to correcting our relationship with trauma, much like the one Deb described. I won't bother trying to paraphrase it. And Deb, I'm really happy you got to work with someone so experienced with things, because as has been recognized, it can go the other way. You can have some self-professed guide or maybe even a misguided professional who really doesn't know what they're doing, make things worse. And that speaks to the second point I wanted to briefly make. About 20 of the exemptions Theracell got issued were not for patients, they were for caregivers. Because I think when the person who's giving the therapy has experienced the psychedelic state firsthand without the social baggage that comes with contravening the law, and they can openly discuss this with their patient, tell them what they think the patient's about to experience, probably while recognizing that they can never really know, because at the end of the day, the real effect is, I think, pretty personal and pretty individual to the person. But if you're talking to someone who's never used these substances before, who's traumatized, who's trusting you as a professional to help them, it's really, really important that the professional has firsthand had the experience and understands exactly what they're asking this person to go through. Because if things get difficult, and they can, especially with naive users who are dealing with trauma, it's all the more important for them to know that the only meaningful lifeline, which will be that person or persons, usually have two facilitators in the room at the same time, to that they get it, that they understand, and that when they say, I think you're going to be okay, it isn't just a platitude. It is them speaking from experience. And again, that just goes to destigmatizing and accepting that if we're going to use these materials in psychotherapy, as was done in the 60s, like in large numbers, including here in Saskatchewan, Erica Dick's book, amazing, Psychedelics on the Prairies, the U of S, where I went to school, had no idea it had that kind of history until recently. But it's just so important that the practitioner knows. And that actually dovetails nicely into the comments about a regulatory framework and whether we're talking about, botanical material or, purified stuff like what's in here, because all of that can exist for psilocybin as well. And to me, just like with our, I'd say, fairly effective cannabis consumer packaged goods system, the main thing is that when people buy a product, if it's psilocybin, that they know how much psilocybin and how much psilocin was measured to be in that batch, whether you're purchasing fruiting bodies or whether you're purchasing something where it's easier to tell, like pure compound, like what Cygen makes, or anything extracted from the mushroom, like what we have. At least Numinous and Filament are two companies that are working with extracts and testing them and characterizing them. And I believe in each case, starting clinical trials. So it's important for the people using any drug to know how much is there. And for a DIN, it's important to know the indication and that it's being used on label or educated off label use. I mean, a large number of prescriptions are off label anyway. Psychedelics are not going to be any different. It's going to be up to the psychiatrist, usually the psychiatrist who's making the prescription, to decide what they think makes sense for their patient. So to me, it's all about, GMP, or if we're talking about botanicals, maybe something analogous to cannabis is GPP, so that the material's only what it says it is and that it's not contaminated. And then knowing the amount of the drug. If you're in a system that is not DIN, if you're not talking pharmaceutical, Food and Drug Regulations Part C products. If it's Food and Drug Regulations Part C pharmaceutical product, then, there's nothing to say. It just complies with all the standards that are needed. And there you go. It's, if you're outside of that in a medical access system like we have for cannabis and like we had for cannabis consistent with UN obligations prior to the Cannabis Act, then to me, it's all about, are we comfortable that this material is safe enough to access this way? And if so, is it labeled correctly? And is it free of contamination? And then it's all really up to the healthcare provider, the physician who's writing the medical document, or the nurse practitioner, if we follow cannabis's lead. And then unlike cannabis, the downstream healthcare providers who are going to be doing most of the hours on this, which is psychotherapy and support and integration. Another thing Deb mentioned, integration, from everything I've heard, is the most important part. It's not the experience itself. In fact, it's my understanding that under MAPS MDMA protocol, there's very little discussion between the patient and the person in the room during the MDMA experience. They're there more as a facilitator. And the real magic happens the next day when they have their integrative psychotherapy session. Anyway, I really want to, we haven't heard from David in a while, and I don't want to be the only one talking.
Thank you, David. And yes, I will turn to David Clements. I want to hear your reaction to the comments so far, but also you mentioned earlier that policymakers have some tough decisions to make. There's a need for education. And all that needs to be supported by evidence. And I wanted to also understand what evidence you feel needs to be prioritized and generated in the near term to evolve this field.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I'll try to be very pithy in what's a very complex problem. What I would say is I think it's absolutely vital that scientists in particular step out of their comfort zones at this period of time. If I look at the emails that I get on a weekly basis, and probably many others on the call get as well, they are emails that go, my 22-year-old son has been on high doses of every SSRI available and things have only gotten worse for him. Please, how do I get him enrolled in a trial as soon as possible, and who do I talk to? There's a lot to unpack in that question. But certainly I would say the call is for scientists to be engaged in ways that perhaps scientists are not always comfortable in doing, in speaking directly to those patients and frankly, members of the public as well. And I want to draw that distinction there. Polling tells us that mostly Canadians are okay with psychedelics if a doctor thinks it's okay for them to use. And that's not unlike what we saw pre-legalization in polling as it related to cannabis. Right? So scientists need to be able to speak both to those in need who are hurting, but also to speak more broadly to the Canadian population about what the evidence here and where it is going, and frankly, what the best available evidence is. If we wait for perfect evidence, we will never make decisions in any of these contexts. So too for clinicians, they're getting the same questions that I'm getting here at Queen's, right? And much more acutely within the confines of the doctor-patient relationship. How do they guide those patients who are, because they live in a society with free access to information, how do they guide those patients in terms of what they should be doing to be safe and to be able to take advantage of effective treatments? Those clinicians will have their own restrictions, whether they are legal requirements from CMPA or others, whether they are guidance that they have received. And so we need to be able to think, how do we synthesize that evidence and make it usable for folks? And finally, closest to my heart as it relates to policymakers and regulators. Again, I said earlier, I think we need to be empathetic to those folks. If we were talking about pest management in this country, we would not say people that work in the pest management regulatory agency should just make decisions about what they feel are the best insecticides to be made available and where they should be used, right? We would say, no, those people ought to work within a regulatory framework where their scope is quite clear and where what constitutes the evidence that should be used and included and applied should be clear. And the process by which they engage with stakeholders, many of whom will have vested interests, is also very clear. They'll be trying to operate within the same context as it pertains to things like psychedelics. And I think we need to be understanding of that. And we need to think about how we assist those folks to be able to make what will be, I think, some very challenging decisions for them, both in terms of how they use that evidence, but also within the current context within which they work.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that. And I just want to turn to Lashmi. I think we've talked about the potential of psychedelics in the context of mental health, but you alluded to earlier the potentially broader application of psychedelics, and maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more in terms of neurodegenerative diseases as well. And I think that's an interesting field that may be less familiar.
Absolutely. So I want to preface that with the idea that, as I was mentioning, psychedelics are these molecules that act on the brain and spinal cord. They do alter, and there is now evidence in that context that they alter our connectivities in the brain, sometimes blood flow, things of that nature. And the implications of that is that our brain physically, there is connectivity similar to our home electrical connectivities. In our home, we've got that. And those are changing when we are using molecules that act on brain. That happens with many of those things. So imagine me randomly taking a wire from my home from basement and connecting somewhere on the first floor or somewhere else, right? So that is what, if I were to, as a researcher, relate to why sometimes when these are used without proper direction, medical direction, things could go wrong. But also in a different way, if I know exactly what I'm doing with my wires, I can do better. So in that context, both the challenge and the opportunity here for us is this. A number of molecules from the plants and otherwise that we know, LSDs, MDMAs, or psilocybins, whatnot, all of those. And as a society, some people have good experience, some not so much, and there is good use. The idea of defining what are the diseases that we can use this for, and clinically, what we need to understand is how can my clinician identify that I have that disease or that indication? That's an important thing. That's where the education, the policy changes and the education, how to come into that, right? For the clinicians. And number two, if, for example, some of my, I actually have some slides, maybe Brian can put that up there, neurodegenerative disorders. And I can give you some examples like Alzheimer's, which we know, or Parkinson's, including multiple sclerosis, things of this nature. We are now learning, especially in the past 5 to 7 years. This is all research, by the way, not totally clinical yet, but evidence that when our wires are going wrong, that could lead to major depression or PTSD-like condition, things of that nature. So the train of thought that's evolving is that could we use these molecules that operate on the brain and change the brain in different ways to also help with the neurodegenerative conditions, which, as you know, is another round of diseases, if you will, that are debilitating our society. So that's the broad picture connectivity, if you will, between these two. And again, I want to mention that it's very, very important to understand what these molecules are doing and how clinicians can identify how they are dealing and how to define the disease also. Otherwise, one would end up doing irreversible damage. That is highly likely, or it could take a long time to reverse that, to a person's state. So that's, I think, in a way, there is a huge opportunity for sure. And I also want to preface some of the history for molecules. Like we know a lot of SSRIs, we've heard of it, psychedelics community know about it. If we look at the chemical structures of these molecules, SSRIs are some of the molecules that work on our brain, and psychedelic molecules, there is similarities in this. So there you go. So there are similarities in the structures. So it makes perfect sense that these molecules act on brain. It's just that as responsible society, how do we do proper research, basic and clinical research, educate our clinicians and pharmacists, and make sure that we are bringing these responsibly into use rather than in medicine. We have a lot of examples where that didn't go well, right? And we want to avoid those mistakes. Some of you might know thalidomide, back in the 1960s for morning sickness, did not go well. It was pulled out. And every 2-3 years, we hear those stories coming out. So it's important to be responsible so that we understand that. I stop there, please.
Thank you, Lakshmi. And I apologize, there's a lot of great questions, and maybe the panelists can respond in the chat to some if they'd like, but just interested to hear, open up to the panelists if you can comment on the regulatory oversight of the clinics that are popping up, the ketamine clinics, as well as, I find this interesting, the use of potentially immersive technology as that's evolving too in potentially at-home use of some of these things. Any volunteers to comment on that? And I'll just ask to keep it very brief because we just want to leave a minute to conclude today. Thank you.
I can speak to that. So very briefly, S-ketamine made by Johnson & Johnson is on label for depression. That is, there's left and right-handed molecules. S-ketamine is just the left-handed one. Racemic ketamine, which is both, is a sedative. It's an anesthetic. It's supposed to be used by anesthesiologists. So if it's being administered intravenously or intramuscularly, then it has to be in a special, I can't remember the regulatory term. It's different in every province. It definitely exists in Alberta and in Ontario. I'm sure it's everywhere, but it's kind of like an out-of-hospital surgical suite. You sort of need that extra level of infrastructure if you're going to give it with a needle. If you're giving people lozenges, then it's much simpler to do. And yes, you can just do it. It actually has very little to do with Health Canada and a lot more to do with provincial colleges of physicians and surgeons. I'll let someone else comment on the VR part. Personally, I think VR, you can integrate it into what you're doing. I don't think you need it. I think it's just another approach. But I think I'm not, to me, it seems like it might be a little bit distracting, but that is my personal opinion. I'm sure it has tons of potential.
So just in our final minute, I'll ask one final question, ask each panelist to just provide their 30-second answer. And if you were Prime Minister, what policy changes would you like to see to ensure people can really benefit from psychedelic therapies? Maybe I'll begin with Deb.
Oh, there we go. Well, this really isn't my wheelhouse, but if you're asking me about shifts that I'd like to see, I kind of would like to see a shift away from this fear-based kind of thinking towards the drugs as being the primary issue here and what they're going to cause, and maybe more towards like an empathic or acceptance kind of model of, looking at underlying causes and that type of thing.
Okay, thank you, Deb. David Clemens?
I think I can't actually answer the question as I'm technically on leave from the Public Service of Canada and can't be seen publicly to be telling the Prime Minister what he should do. So I'll answer it this way. I'm certainly very optimistic that the folks that run our research granting councils in this country, not only in health, but also in natural sciences and engineering and social sciences and humanities, frankly, are as preoccupied as we are about many of the questions that are being discussed today. And I'm certainly very optimistic and hopeful that there will be significant public research investments in this country. And I think industrial academic partnerships are great, but I think we really do need strong government investments in the area, in the broad range of research that's needed in this area.
Thank you, Dave. Lakshmi?
Sure. I would probably advise the government to remove the barriers for R&D based industry and researchers so that appropriate drug molecules can be brought in and researchers can try to bring them close to the patients for use.
Thank you. And David, what?
I would create a medical psilocybin access system that allows psilocybin products to be sold essentially identically to how cannabis products were sold before the Cannabis Act. And then I would let the provincial colleges decide when and where that psilocybin should be used. I would simply set up the infrastructure for the products to exist and then back off because the rest is provincial.
Thank you so much, David. And I want to thank everyone. I apologize we didn't get to all the questions from the audience, but I want to thank everyone for the great discussion, a really fascinating topic and really great insights. I appreciate your time this morning. And I will turn it over to my colleague Allison to just wrap up the day. Thank you, everyone, again.
So thank you very much, everybody. That was fascinating. I think that's just what our LSO knowledge and networking breakfasts are about, because it really, I think we all learned a huge amount. I certainly did, about an area that we all hear about, but we don't really know a lot about. So I really want to thank all of you. I just want to do a couple of housekeeping comments here. So first of all, and I think it's membership renewal time, January. And so you will get emails, but you can go online. If you're not already a member, please consider it. You can call the LSO office and discuss it if you want more information. But it's a great organization to be a member of. It's got real momentum in all sectors, really seemed to be taking a leadership position across the country, and we're here for you. So please, please feel free to call the office if you want more information, or just go online and sign up for your renewal. I would also just point out a couple of upcoming events. So on February 1st, we have an event, the Advancing Canadian Healthcare Through Innovation series that is done. And this is about procuring change, advancing Canadian innovation. So please join us for that. That's February 1st. We also have a career talk. So I cannot emphasize enough, if you're in this space, and also if you're looking to bring people into your space that are beyond the lab coat, what does a career look like? In life sciences, health, medical, and agriculture. I can tell you all three people who are speaking have really great expertise. Even my job today, if you want to link in, we can chat. I never knew existed in life science. So you'd be shocked about the number of different things that are available to you. And it's absolutely worth having that conversation. So join us on February 8th in the evening, actually, for that conversation. Finally, I would like to thank all our corporate sponsors. So as they're seen, I'm not going to read them all, but certainly you can see all of the great groups here. Our gold sponsors as well, so the previous ones were platinum, our gold sponsors here, and also coming up our silver sponsors. I'd also specifically like to thank our event sponsor, Fsd Pharma, and also all of you for attending. It was a great turnout, great questions, and we really look forward to seeing you next session. So have a great morning, everybody.